Good afternoon. I want to make a few comments about what's happening with the South African National Defence Force, but the underlying issue I want to highlight here is what's happening in Cuba and the Cuban approach to communism. Now, the South African National Defence Force, or the South African Army, was once the strongest army on the African continent, but it has now been reduced from a practical operational army to a ceremonial army to a non-existing army. And even though the army is virtually a non-existing army, they do maintain these extravagant payments to Cuba, to the Cuban government. And a recent report was just issued on this, which found that one particular item on the budget or the list of expenditures by the South African Army is training of medical students in Cuba. And it was found that this training is 136% more expensive than comparative military medical courses in South Africa. It was also found that if they had done the same training in South Africa, in their own country, they would have saved more than 120 million rands over the last few years. It was also found that unlawful expenditures by the South African Defence Force to Cuban contracts surpassed 300 million rands only in the last financial year. And the Auditor General in South Africa has found that this makes no sense, that it is irrational, and that these contracts have to be reviewed so that South Africa will also benefit from it. Now think about this for a moment. What the Auditor General is saying is that hundreds of millions of South African rands are spent on something that makes no sense. It's only to the benefit of Cuba, but there's no benefit for South Africa in this. Now we might say that this doesn't make sense. Unless, of course, if you consider the bigger picture here, then it makes perfectly sense. And the bigger picture is that the South African government is very firmly committed to international communist solidarity. And that these expenditures are made to Cuba because Cuba is a communist country, and proudly so. And Cuba is working very hard to prove to the world that communism can work. And of course, the South African government is very eager to help them in this. Now, the communist story in Cuba is fascinating. Of course, they had the revolution, the communist revolution in 1959, which wasn't a communist revolution because just like the ANC in South Africa, they did not regard themselves as communists, or at least they didn't present themselves as communists. Only after the revolution did Castro come out, after the Bay of Pigs actually, to say, listen, we are communist and we're going to implement communism in South Africa. And it was the same in South Africa with the ANC, who, under the banner of a national democratic revolution, presented themselves as liberals and as Democrats. Of course, in order to get power, so that once they get power, then they can start implementing socialist ideas. Now, a fascinating thing about revolution in Cuba is that to the revolutionaries in Cuba, with Fidel Castro at the helm, revolution is not a means to an end. Revolution is the end. It is the highest goal, the ultimate good. Now, one would think that a revolution is aimed at liberating people, but not in Cuba. The Cuban approach to revolution is that people have to be liberated so that there can be a revolution. And the revolution is about continually, never-endingly, dramatically trying to working to change society in virtually every conceivable way. Now, Cuba regards itself today as, in many ways, as the last man standing when it comes to communism, because all the other communist countries have collapsed. Now, of course, you could say the Cuban economy has also collapsed, but they would like us to believe that it isn't so. So they try to maintain this facade simply by lying. So, for example, according to the official Cuban statistics, unemployment in Cuba is less than 1%. And now I've spent some time in Cuba, 2 weeks in Cuba actually, earlier this year. And anyone who's been to Cuba recently would say the same thing, which is that Cuba is filled, the cities in Cuba are filled with beggars, people in the street begging for money. Certainly not the image you think of when someone tells you it's a country with less than 1% unemployment. So I actually, when I was there, I approached a tour guide who, of course, works for the government, because virtually everyone works for the government in Cuba. And I asked this person why, if the Cuban if unemployment in Cuba is less than 1%, who are all these people? And so this person explained to me that they are not unemployed, they are simply begging for a hobby. Now, Cuba today, of course, suffers under sanctions, and as was the case with Zimbabwe, the Cuban government are very quick to blame all of their failures on sanctions and on the West. What they don't say, of course, is why these sanctions exist, and they're not as eager to talk about the fact that billions of dollars worth of property in Cuba was expropriated by the Cuban government, of course, without compensation to the US. So the revolutionaries in Cuba seem to think that you can just take people's stuff with violence, and when they respond and retaliate, then they are the immoral ones. Now, the Cuban economy is in a dire situation, but the Cuban strategy to communism seems to be just simply to make the country completely dependent on other countries that share their ideological pursuit. Cuba was once the world's greatest exporter of sugar. That industry is virtually non-existent in Cuba currently. And so as the economy tanks in Cuba, they latch on to other bigger countries. And they did this with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And of course, then the Soviet Union collapsed. So then they did that with Venezuela, where they became completely dependent on Venezuela economically. And then Venezuela collapsed. And now they seem to be doing this with South Africa, to try to make Cuba completely dependent on the South African economy. Now, we also know that all is not well with the South African economy. But the bigger underlying issue here that I want to emphasize is that what's very evident and very clear from this is that the South African government is more concerned about its commitment to the dying international communist movement than it is to the well-being of its own citizens.